Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at priests, procurators, and prefects in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. The Jewish priesthood goes back to Aaron, the brother of Moses, who had been appointed by God to be the priest, not just the priest, the high priest of all of the Jewish people, for the land of Israel, for the people of Israel. And all priests were descended from Aaron. Now, when we come to the days of David and Solomon, that family lineage grows narrower in that the high priest was appointed from the family of Zadok. Zadok had been a priest in the days of David, and he had sided with Solomon in the Adonijah revolt. Adonijah, the younger brother of Solomon, had tried to take over the kingdom, and that revolt was very short-lived. And Zadok had allied himself with Solomon, and so as a result, he was anointed as priest at the same time as high priest at the same time that Solomon was anointed as king. That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 22. And so in the days of David and Solomon, the priesthood had been organized, or perhaps reorganized, into 24 specific courses. That is, 24 sets of families where the priesthood was divided among them, and they would take their turns serving in the temple, so that every priest didn't have to be there every day of the year in the temple. Instead, you would be on for an entire week, morning and evening, and then you would be allowed to go home, and then your turn would come up eventually, and your course would go back to the temple for another week. And of course, on the high days, for example, at Passover and Yom Kippur, on the special feast days, all the courses would be present. But then throughout the rest of the year, if you were a priest, you only had to be at the temple when it was the turn of your course. You actually see a reference to this in Luke chapter 1, where one of the courses was there, the course from which Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, belonged. Now, the end of the Zadok family, and I say this as a theory because this is still argued, but the Zadok clan had been high priests until Onias III was murdered by Antiochus the Fourth. Remember Antiochus Epiphanes? He called himself Antiochus the Magnificent, that Greek king who had been trying to exercise dominion over the Jews. In 174, he arranged the murder of the high priest, and he allowed Menelaus, a individual who was not even a descendant of Aaron, to purchase the priesthood. Now, Menelaus was short-lived. He only had that priesthood for a few years, and he was eventually replaced when the Hasmoneans took over. Remember the days of the Maccabees? Well, the Maccabees, that was their nickname. The word Maccabee means the ones who hammer, the hammers, because they had hammered Antiochus and his forces, and they delivered Israel from the Greeks. And of course, that family name, like I said, the nickname is Maccabees, but the family name, they're known as the Hasmoneans. And when they delivered the temple, they took the high priesthood. They were already priests, but they took the high priesthood for themselves. Now, this brings up the question, were they from that family of Zadok, or were they superseding Zadok to now make for themselves the high priesthood? They hadn't been high priests before, but were they part of that extended family? And there's some discussion, there's some debate on that question. If you ask the Essenes, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, they would have said, no, they're not legitimate. They're not from that family. They had superseded. It's not entirely clear. When we look at all the sources, when we look at Josephus, he's not specific as to what family they were from. Well, we have the end of the Hasmoneans with the coming of Herod the Great. Antigonus, the last of the Hasmonean priests, was beheaded by Herod the Great in 37 BC after he had returned from Rome as the official king of the Jews. And of course, he had to fight for his kingdom to get it back. And he did so. But then Herod took the last surviving of the Hasmoneans, not a priest, but a woman, a princess, Mariamne, to be his wife, and he married Mariamne to perhaps legitimize his stance as king of the Jews, but also, by all accounts, he fell in love with her. And that was perhaps unfortunate to both of them, because there were plots uncovered to try to remove him and put his two sons by her on the throne in his place. And he ended up having her executed and also having those two sons. We'll look at those in just a moment. They were put to death. But now the high priesthood began to be a political appointment, no longer passed from father to son, although there would be some of that. But now you would have a number of different people succeeding to that office of high priest. And as I said, the Essenes, the folks that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were bitterly against the high priesthood that was ruling from Jerusalem. And they have some very nasty things to say about the high priest. They call him all sorts of names, the one who comes from darkness, and some very bad things that they say about him. Here's the family of Herod the Great. Now, I've only put 4 out of, I think he had as many as 10 different wives, not all at the same time, although that might have been the case for some. We already mentioned Mariamne and her 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, and both of those sons are going to be executed by Herod the Great, along with their mother and later on those 2 sons. He had a son by Doris named Antipater, named after Herod's father. He's also going to be arrested and executed just a week or so before Herod finally dies. He had 2 sons by Malthach, who was a Samaritan, so Archelaus and Antipas, and both of these will not only survive, but they will be leaders among the Jews after the death of Herod the Great. And finally, there's another Mariamne. Mariamne, I'm referring to her as the second, who has Herod Philip, and he is going to be given a portion over which to rule as well. Now I want to talk about Roman procurators. The job of a procurator was to procure the taxes, and they would be assigned different regions throughout the Roman Empire. His job was to collect the taxes and then deliver those taxes to Rome, and nobody minded if he collected some additional taxes that would go, instead of going to Rome, would go into his pockets. In fact, a popular writer in the 1st century had commented that the typical Roman procurator would spend his first year in office collecting taxes and then skimming money off the top that would pay off the bribes that had gotten him into office. And then he would spend his second year in office collecting taxes, but then skimming off the top the funds that would be used to keep him out of jail when he was tossed out of office. And then if he managed to be in office for 3 or more years, he would be skimming off the top to put into his retirement fund so that he could live happily ever after. We're going to go very briefly through the procurators that were there in Judea and Israel from beginning in 6 AD. Now you say, well, what happened before 6 AD? You'd had Herod the Great, who had died in 4 BC, and then Archelaus, his son, one of his surviving sons, had ruled in his place up until the year 6 AD, but then in 6 AD he was removed. And now you have procurators overseeing things in Israel. Coponius, he's the one who appoints Annas as the high priest. Before that, they'd had a different political appointee. And you see the name Annas in the Gospels. He's still around. He's no longer high priest, although he may have had that as an honorary title from having been the past high priest. Next, we have Marcus Ambivius, and when the sister of Herod dies, he actually takes the city of Jamnia, the seaside city, and it is willed to Caesar's wife. We have Aeneas Rufus. It's Caesar Augustus died during his term. Notice that the average term here is about 3 years. So they've got a year to collect the bribes to keep them out of to pay off the bribes that got him into office. They have a year to collect the bribes that are going to keep them out of jail, and one more year for their retirement fund. But next we have Valerius Gratus, and he actually is in office for quite a longer period of time. The first thing he does when he comes on the scene is he deposes Annas as the high priest, and he initially has a different high priest, and then after that, the son of Annas, and then when he's removed, the son-in-law of Annas, who is Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the high priest by the time we get to the story of Jesus. But Valerius Gratus will have gone home by that time, and in his place we have Pontius Pilate. Now we're going to come back and look at Pilate, the one who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus. But for right now, let me just mention his name. We'll come back. Notice he's about 10 years, from 26 to 36 AD. After him, we have Marcellus, again, a fairly short period of time, a little bit longer than some of those earlier ones. And Caiaphas is deposed, and the high priestly garments, which had been confiscated and actually sent to Rome, they are returned from Rome, and they're going to be held in trust in the Antonia fortress, so that when the high priest needs to do a high priestly function, he has to go and request those garments from his Roman overlords. Next, we have Herod Agrippa, and he's not a procurator. He's actually given rule. He's made king, and he is given Judea and Samaria, and he reigns from 41 to 44. And he's not deposed. He's not told to step down. In 44, he dies quite suddenly. And we'll come back and look at him in a moment as well. We have Cuspius Fadus, who took back the garments of the high priest. Notice they're going sort of back and forth. And then a Jewish procurator, Tiberius Julius Alexander. He's Jewish, but not all that popular among all the Jews. Many of them considered him a traitor. And it's during his term in office that we have the famine that had been prophesied in the New Testament. Well, now it breaks forth there in Israel. We have Ventidius Cumanus. During his term, there's a riot in the temple. There had been some riots earlier, but this one's particularly interesting. The Roman soldiers up in the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the temple, one of them, perhaps he was bored, or I don't know what he was thinking, but he lowered his trousers. There's no nice way to say this, and he said, "Hey, you Jews, look at this!" And then he made a rather rude gesture, and it resulted in a riot. And Cumanus did not remain in office for an exceptionally long time. And next, we have Antonius Felix, and Felix is also going to be mentioned in the New Testament in the book of Acts. He had been implicated in the murder of the high priest. And when the Apostle Paul is arrested, he is brought down to Caesarea, and Felix actually, he hears his case, but then he holds Paul, both as a favor to the Jews, and also he's hoping he can collect a bribe, because after all, that's how procurators make their money. They make their money by bribes, and he's hoping that Paul will get his release, will buy his release by giving him a bribe. Of course, it doesn't happen. And then in the year 60, we have Porcius Festus, who comes to replace Felix. And again, we read about this in the book of Acts, how he hears the case of the Apostle Paul, and he says at the end, he really hasn't done anything wrong. We could release him. But he's already appealed to Rome, and so therefore to Rome he must go. And he places Paul upon a ship that's headed for Rome, and Paul leaves Israel for the last time upon that ship. We next have Lucius Albinus. He while he's in office, he doesn't do it, but James, the half-brother to Jesus, is put to death by the Jews while he is away. He's out dealing with some sort of business. And remember, the Jews did not have permission. They did not have the authority to put people to death. That was not under their jurisdiction, but they do it anyway. And then after he is removed from office, the last procurator is going to be Gessius Florus. His reign will actually, his term in office will culminate in the revolt of the Jews, where they will revolt, they will drive him away. A Roman legion will be sent down from Syria to put down the revolt, and the legion will be destroyed. And for a time, for a very short time, Israel will have regained its independence, but it will be very short-lasting indeed, and will culminate in the fall of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the scattering of the Jewish people. Now I'd like to come back and talk about Pontius Pilate. He governed from 26 to 36. We used to think that he was a procurator until this stone was found in Caesarea. It had been initially a part of a monument, but then it had been taken and reused in some later construction. And it refers to Pilate not as a procurator, but as a prefect. When you say, well, what's the difference? Procurator was a civil servant. A prefect was a military man, but they could actually have some give and take between their functions. And so Pilate was both functioning as a procurator, he was procuring the taxes, but he had a bit greater authority there. It was while he came into office, very shortly thereafter, that he had the Roman standards brought into Jerusalem. The standards had effigies, they had pictures and likenesses, both of the emperor, and also there were the Roman eagles. And the Jews did not take kindly to having what they considered to be idols brought into Jerusalem. And so Pilate had ordered it done. In fact, he'd ordered it done under the cover of night. The next day, there they were. The Jews couldn't do anything about them. So the Jewish people came down to Caesarea, where Pontius Pilate had his main offices. This is where he resided. And they came and they insisted, and they said, you have to move those. And he wouldn't listen to them. And they wouldn't give up. They wouldn't leave. They continued pleading and imploring. And finally, Pilate was tired of this, and he called out the Roman guard, and he said, kill them. And rather than fight, the Jews that were there bared their throats and said, we would rather have you cut our throat than bow to these pagan idols. And Pilate had never seen anything like this. So he backed down this time. But that had left a bad taste. And so next we have Pilate going, he doesn't go personally, but he has his personnel go into the temple treasury and steal the money from the temple to pay for waterworks that are aqueducts that are going to be bringing water. They already had some, but they were sort of leaking and they needed to be replaced and updated. And so to pay for this infrastructure, he takes the money out of the temple, the Corban money. And when the Jews complain, and again, a crowd rises up, this time Pilate has had his soldiers undercover, not dressed as soldiers, but dressed as regular people, but hiding their swords. And they burst out among the crowd in the temple, and they kill a number of people rather indiscriminately, not just those that are protesting, but also those who have just come to worship. Now, Luke chapter 13, we have the disciples of Jesus. They come to Jesus and they said, have you seen the news lately? Have you seen what's going on? How Pilate mixed the blood of the worshipers with the sacrifices. He had killed a bunch of them. And of course, Jesus has some words to say about the need of repentance and the need of the aspect that God is one day going to judge, and he's going to give a much harsher judgment than that which Pilate had brought about. A third instance took place where somebody claimed to have found some treasures upon Mount Gerizim, and all you had to say is, hey, gold is there, and all of a sudden there were all sorts of people just converging upon Mount Gerizim in Samaria, and he took that as a sign of rebellion and protest, and so he sent his soldiers in, and again, a number of people were killed. Ultimately, Pilate was recalled to Rome, and there he vanishes from the pages of our history. But you will recall, prior to that, he had officiated at the trial of Jesus. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four gospel accounts, speak about how Pilate was there, about how Pilate had examined him, had said, "I find no fault in him." And yet the crowds had cried out for his crucifixion. It asks the question, what did Pilate do? And of course, Matthew's account tells us about how he went through this hand washing ceremony. He says, "I washed my hands of this," and literally had water brought forth and washed his hands, saying, "I have no part in this." But this brings up the question, because you cannot wash your hands of the Son. What finally happened to Pilate? And we're not told what happened to Pilate, but we also have to ask, what happens with you? You see, you cannot wash your hands of Jesus. You must decide the case. You must decide, is he who he said he was, or is he only someone else? And you have a warning here that in reality, you are the one who is on trial. Because he who believes in the Son has life. But he who does not believe, who does not obey, who does not seek the Son, has been judged already.